Welcome, I'm Julia.
And I am Marta.
And this is LateMode, a podcast in search of the zeitgeist. Through a series of conversations, we explore the fragmented and hyper-connected modes of our current times. Hello there, thanks for listening in. It's Julia here, and welcome to the second episode of LateMode. In this episode, I have invited my friend Ieva to discuss the subversive possibilities of radio, music, and conversations. Ieva hosts a radio show called Auditorijos on startfm, a local community radio based in Vilnus. She writes and teaches, and hopefully soon she will begin her PhD researching how community music radio can offer joyful strategies for civil disobedience and political participation. Hello, Ieva. How are you?
I'm okay. It's been sunny and the spring is here, so I'm all right. How are you?
I'm fine. It's pretty sunny here in Porto as well. Where are you actually?
I'm in Vilnus at the moment, which is my home. Well, it's not my hometown. I moved here in September, but yeah, back to Lithuania, back to Vilnus.
Do you want to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit what are your interests and focus, just to give our listeners a little introduction.
Oh, it's always a difficult thing to introduce yourself, isn't it? Well, I suppose I'm doing sort of three things in the same time. So I'm writing a little bit, I'm teaching a little bit, and I'm researching a little bit, I suppose. So I have a radio show in a local community radio station here in Vilnius, where I interview a lot of different people, which makes this quite a unusual experience for me to be interviewed instead of interview someone else. And this radio show is kind of a part of what I research as well, which is community radios, and in general I'm quite interested in the politics of music, let's say, and politics of music radios. So I'm applying for a PhD, so I can't really call myself a scholar yet, but I'm hoping to be. But I'm also, it's my findings so far. I did a bit of research on Budapest community radios. Before that, I did a bit on historical research about Lithuanian music scenes, alternative music scenes, and I also teach kids with also different things. I don't know if it's a bit eclectic sometimes.
Yeah, I guess this is really why I really wanted to have a conversation with you today. I've been sort of talking to you in the past few months and knowing what you were up to, and you're our first guest here on LateMode podcast, and I thought there is not a better way to start than actually talking about the role of these mediums, right? Like podcasts and podcast, maybe it's a little different than radio. Maybe you should tell me what the difference might be. But before doing that, I actually wanted to tell you what the surprise theme of today is going to be. I don't know if you have already listened to our first episode where me and Marta, the other co-host, are introducing the modes of this podcast, which essentially leaves a theme for the next guest to be explored by the one who comes after them. And given you're the first one, Marta has drawn up a bunch of themes that have come up from our previous conversation. I think that would be really interesting for us today to see how you can explore the theme of art at the intersection of social sciences. I guess going back to my previous question, let's talk about what you will see as a difference between a podcast and a radio. And through that, you can tell us a little more about your research.
Okay. It's been, I think I've raised this question with my interviewees, with the sort of the radios that I've researched. What is a podcast and what's a radio show? And I personally have one is very obvious, I suppose. One technical answer is that if you do a live radio show, you have this kind of flawed, reality where you make mistakes and you kind of podcast can be edited out. So this element of liveness. But the reason why I'm so interested in the radio is that I think it is radio in itself, especially community radio, implies that you have a certain, I wouldn't call it necessarily an institution, but let's say an organization, a gathering of people, right, who do shows together in different times. So you have a physical space like a studio. It not necessarily has to be, studio as in, very technical studio. It can be someone's flat, but it has a hub, and social sciences, sociality, it comes in, right? So I think today we do live in times of sort of oversaturation of media, and when making a decision to create new content, I think it's quite daunting to take the responsibility of, this, what I will create now, I will do, I don't know whether it's writing or talking or painting or doing music. I think a lot of people ask themselves, there's so much done and so much out there. Do I have anything to say? And when you're part of a community like a radio station or a newspaper or, like a band, you're not only the only one who's making that decision. So you have someone else, your colleague saying, oh, you know what, like, it sounds like you have a great idea for a show, or, I've heard your show and it's nice. And I think now we miss that. We want this kind of curatorial element in what we consume, whether that's, whatever that would be. And I think that's one of the reasons why, I think we can talk also about Spotify and things like that, but I think one of the reasons why community radios are coming back with, NTS is very popular again, I think, and it's growing. And, almost every big city in Europe has a local radio station now. And I think one of the reasons is that we want to have this human element, not only, have just shuffle of everything that's out there.
But when I was reading your PhD proposal, I think one of the most interesting things to discuss today, which interestingly, I think it fits in the topic of art and social science and intersection. It's how you are approaching the musical component of radio in terms of proposing alternative strategies.
Well, I think there are several things about that, but there's definitely, I wanted to, I think, when you do research, you're a killjoy of everything. You take something that's poetry and you overanalyze it. You take something that's humor, and you take the humor, the fun out of it, And I think it's the same with music. When you want to research music, by doing it with the tools that are inherently, sort of academic, so kind of, analyzing the roots, asking the hows, looking into context, you take away all the fun that what actually makes music and what makes it social, right? Is this kind of intangible element of taste, of what people coming together and just having a good time. And that's why for me it was quite interesting and important to talk about music community radios, is because I think so in my proposal, I talk about strategies of resistance, so it's strategies of political participation, right? So it's not, there are many different strategies, I suppose, that music can be a part of. But when I think talking about something that's quite, something like politics, right? Something that in itself is quite conceptual and analytical, I suppose, or at least, we use words for politics. And then music can offer alternative mode of communication, which is not only words. So, if we have academia, we have words, right? We have politics, we have words, and then music comes in. And it's not the only way, of course, but I think in that sense, then it allows that sociality that's not just linguistic, to also,
It is also linguistics in terms of lyrics, I guess.
Sure. But I think that's the point, right? We don't, we can talk about that. How what happens to language when it's being sung, right? What I think is that, I don't know, I'm quite interested in rhythms, I think. And I think that's what music does to language, but also what language, good communication does to language as well. So it adds certain rhythm and beat, and with that, I think, comes the pleasure of listening.
This goes back, I don't know if I see it correctly, but also what you were talking about, bringing back this fun into political discussions in this case, and sort of like communication between people who might have like different opinions. And as I see it, you maybe are researching this topic of music because it is one of the mediums that has the potential of doing so.
I think it's also, I think why we do things is often very coincidental. I always thought that, I think if it so had happened that I went not to a music school when I was a kid, but to an art school, maybe I'd be an art historian now. It's not, but it's just like because I'd learned to dig deeper within the sort of sonic because of the circumstances, it kind of became. And of course, now I can say that, oh, I'm very interested in sound because I think it's the secondary medium. We're not as literate in our listenings as we are in our sight. Like the visual is much more. We're much more versed in how to communicate through the visual rather than through the sounds. And then you have touch or smells, which is completely so of course, like now I can say like, oh, that's why I'm interested in music, because it has been overlooked, whatever. But I think why it just I kind of ended up here. Really, it's a coincidence, really.
But I mean, you're very proactive. I was looking at, some recent stuff you've been up to, and you're very proactive in this area, I guess, and especially now that you're researching radios. I think I would really like to dig a little bit deeper into like your experience of being a radio host and kind of having conversations with people. How do you feel like situated in this position?
Mm. Yeah, I love it. Genuinely, like it's from like, I think, well, I also really love writing. So writing is like something that I still feel like I wish I did more, or I mean, I wish I could live off of it. Essentially, I wish I could live off of my writing. But yeah, just I think this is somewhere I need to grow more. But apart from writing, doing radio shows, I just love it so much. I think it's from all the things that I've ever done. And, these are not necessarily a very broad scope of things. They're still very much in this, like, academic, I suppose, realm. Hosting a radio show is by far the best. And I think, well, one of the reasons is that I think it's so nice to ask questions, but also like, and have them actually answered in a very personal way. So instead of looking for ultimate answers, it's much more about trying to just find how each one of us, depending on the topic, makes sense out of whatever it is. And I think just it's just like having, I mean, I've had some fantastic people on my show, so it's just having an opportunity to talk to them about something that they do, and just asking questions is lovely. And I just love that it allows me to have this semi publicity, which I think is also why radios are so interesting. So I'm not, you're still out there, and it's public and people listen to you, but yet you're not seen, you're not, it's not your face, it's your voice. And also when you're the one asking questions, you put your guest in the spotlight. So I really love this position.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting what you're saying, because I've just been this week trying to record my first video ever, and I'm just so not used to that. We're sort of working on this project. I don't want to go into details now, but there's sort of like a series of videos, and for the first time I was sort of confronted to this idea of having myself, like my physical person. Like I'm very fine with my voice, obviously, with my writing, but it really just sort of changes this idea that you're gonna be like out there with your physical body, I guess.
Yeah.
But going back to what you were saying, can you give us some examples of some of your favorite interviews, or what, like, how does your radio show work? Do you yourself select people, or is it more like a community choice?
No, it's just me, really. So it all started so we studied, you and I, we studied in Amsterdam together, right? We started a Sound in Action initiative there with a few of my course mates. And the Sound in Action initiative was aimed at, and still is, aimed at communicating humanities knowledge to broader audiences. So we started doing these events where we would choose a topic. So I don't know, it was compatibility in space or sound and displacement. So, you take a real life topic like, displacement, and then you combine that with a musicological question. So let's say, how does home sound? And then you invite people who have embodied lived experience of that, or they have knowledge of that. And you kind of talk about it, but not necessarily in this very academic sense. I mean, you still use academic tools, but it's open for the wide audience. So I wanted my radio show to be so that's where I got my inspiration, because then we ended up, after the pandemic started, we moved on to podcasts. And this went very well, and I enjoyed doing that a lot. And I've decided I want to do my own radio show, especially since I was researching community radios. It seemed very poignant. And so at the beginning, I had like a list of topics of what I thought would be interesting. So our first show, I invited two friends of mine, and we talked about music and technology. So there was kind of idea that I have all of this knowledge, and I want to just invite interesting people, have nice conversations, and perhaps communicate and share for what for me seemed very obvious, but for a lot of my friends and listeners were like, oh, we never thought about it that way. So this kind of, that was my goal. It changed a bit. Now I'm more concerned with my guests having a good time rather than my listeners. I think, in a way, for me, the most important thing is that we would enjoy the process of recording a show, because I think I've kind of decide that there is a bit of arrogance in assuming that you can guess what your listener wants. You still think about the listener, of course, and you're not doing that for yourself only. But people definitely are quite good, I think, at choosing what they enjoy. So
it's super nice what you're saying. And if I understand it correctly, it's almost as if with time and sort of putting yourself into this mode of interviewing people and this kind of like broader, in this context of podcasts and radio, it shifted a little bit from just the thing itself, like, okay, let's record for like all these many people are going to listen to us or whatever, but it's more like a sort of internal, like enjoying the process, like kind of making it good for you, being there, exploring, and also good for the immediate person who's in front of you, right? The person that you're having a conversation with, like right now.
Oh, definitely, definitely. So what I was kind of mentioning, I think you start, as with anything, really, you start observing your life and everyday situations as potential radio shows, if that makes sense. So it's like, oh, like, oh, this could be an idea. Suddenly, there are these ideas, or things happen, and you're like, oh, I need to do a radio show on that because that's just happening. So it definitely is an outlet of your own reflections of the world. And this is, I think, what's the beautiful part of curating, is that you form a voice, even though you obviously, like, I'm really trying to put my speakers at front. So, they are the ones who I'm trying not to, it's not about like whether I like what they do. Of course, there's a value and sort of morale framework, right? I want to share my platform with people who who are just not, who hold a certain morality standard, I suppose. I'm not going to have like a racist, fascist, populist on my show, But apart from these, I'm more curious. I'm not necessarily invited people whose, let's say, music, if it's a musician whose music I love. It's not about my taste. It's more about my curiosity. But still, because I find something fascinating about what people do, I end up forming a voice and reflecting my own worldview in my show, for sure.
What you just said is very interesting in terms of morals, wanting to share like the space of your radio show with people who maybe are in line with a certain, moral that you want to maintain. And this is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot for these LateMode conversations. What would it be like if we actually would invite someone that is like so different from us? Like, will we be able to maintain this kind of flow of conversation? Would be like, would we find ourselves like in a really difficult position and maybe not even able like to really continue like the conversation going on? And yeah, I wonder what you think about that. I mean, especially I guess as you studying how radio could also help in a way maintaining this democratic conversation going on between people.
Well, it's a difficult question. It's a big one.
Sorry, I
And
didn't want to put you on the spot.
no, that's okay. That's a good question, though. Thanks for asking it. And I'm glad that you think I can answer these moral dilemmas.
I think that this is very much personal. Like I'm
Yeah,
asking, it's really directed at you, not at radio
yeah,
in general, but how would
yeah.
you go about it?
So, but this is, I think, so actually, yes, I think personal is definitely a key word here, and I think it kind of, in that sense, answers both part of your questions. One being, how do I, or how does one create a democratic space in their own show without being, I suppose, too selective? Is that because that's what you're asking, right? Like, how do we actually share our knowledge with groups that we might not necessarily interact on a everyday basis? Like, so it's keeping our bubble. And the second one is, how does that kind of reflect this larger goal of what radio can be, and that's what I'm researching, I suppose. So I think that in terms of what we can do as radio hosts or podcast hosts, is I think it's very much about like picking your battles, isn't it? So I feel personally, for me, my goal is to talk about how music in different contexts. That's how I defined it, right? Music and sound in different contexts. And sound, yeah, it should be important to note not only music but sound, right? So because my role is in that sense a bit, or I try to be a bit educational, I suppose, or kind of just communicating these knowledges. I don't necessarily always think that my goal is to build bridges between different parts of society. So I personally don't think that my energy spent on perhaps arguing with someone that I disagree with will necessarily have the best outcomes. If that's, if polemic is, I mean, there needs to be a space for that, for us to interact and discuss different political projects with people who have different worldviews. That's for certain. We need that political conflict, and I think we need more of it in our everyday lives. But I don't think that, my radio shows a place for that, in a sense. And also, I think it's, what can we do? What power do we have? I don't think I'm that powerful to actually be able to share my power yet, or my privilege yet, in order to really have some really dramatic shifts in society. If I think, the higher the more you do, and the higher up you go in your kind of societal, I don't know, I suppose just as the power hierarchy structure, right? If I was on a national broadcaster and I would actually have the power to really perhaps change the society's view of, I don't know, migrants, perhaps then. But then again, I suppose I would still use my platform for voices that are unheard elsewhere. But second part of the question, so I think that's the beauty of community radio, is that every host comes with their personal ideas, and they share their radio space for their personal preferences. And I think that's what democratic media is kind of about, is that anyone can come and do their show, and as long as it's not hateful, we are contributing to this plurality of voices. So I'm trying to do my show as honest as I can, in a sense that, this is kind of me, and that was what I'm interested in.
I mean, me and Marta were really precisely discussing this, that we wanted to make this podcast also as a space of care. And what does it mean to care when you care also for yourself, for the conversations that you want to have, for the space that you want to give to the to the guests that you invite and the kind of like conversations that you never find the time to have to sort of like satisfy your curiosity of like what other people are thinking about. And I think that when we start feeling limited by this idea, like, with this, we got to change the world, or with this, we've got to do this, it's where we, as you said, where it's not that democratic after all. There is no chance, I think, that we can be possibly inviting in any radio show all of the singular sort of representatives of different worldviews. You know, there are so many at the moment with so many different opinions. And so, as you were talking before, I actually thought of a question to ask you. I'm just curious to know how much of this, using this medium of radio and kind of making it this, let's say, one of the modes that you use to navigate life, how much this has impacted you as an individual in your daily life, and not when you're sort of, you know, on the radio or when you're interviewing people.
I think for me, it gave me a bit of sense of meaning when I started doing it. So it was like, it was almost a year ago, right? So it was the pandemic spring, second pandemic spring. And I think it just, because it is an activity that I really love, but for me personally, it just gave me this, even when you're the most upset you can be, and you're like, but I have my own radio show. And it adds a bit of that kind of, what, maybe I'm not doing everything. Like, maybe everything is not so bad. Maybe I'm not such a, when you're really down and you feel like, oh, I'm just failing at everything. Having this little something, whatever it is, I think it's about any creative outlet, right? Whether it's, you're writing poetry, you're doing radio show, or you're painting, or you're dancing. It's just like, oh, but I do that, I create something. So I think that definitely has a sense of pride. I'm proud of it, I'm actually proud of it. And so it adds to your everyday life. It also adds a bit of that framework, I suppose. And I think it's just a nice commitment in which you can also experiment a lot. So you'll have to do the next show, but you also know that you can do it about whatever you want, because in community radios, nobody's really looking over your shoulder trying to tell you, that this is how you have to do it. And, having someone else listening to your show, whether it's, just your colleagues, because still someone else will have to listen to it. All of that, I think, is very important in just having, and I remember you and I, we had this, remember when we were in Amsterdam, we said that we have realized that if we don't do anything creative, we're going mental. Like, we need to do something that's not right, that's not study, that's not work. So I think doing a radio show is something that, it's something for yourself, but also for others. And it's, it's good. And you can't give it up so easily, because you know that there is potentially someone listening to you. So it's strange. It's strange to be, it's strange to answer these questions, like to be answering questions, because
Well, that's what we were discussing in our meetings, right?
Right, exactly.
You said to me you were really looking forward, and also that it was going to be a little bit strange to be on the other side, sort of like answering questions about you, questioning other people.
I don't think I've ever been interviewed like this, like not for a, I have to stand my ground. What's my ground? I don't know what are my views?
I definitely don't want to, I don't think that there is, I think that our views are just a flux, right? I mean, we could be really, of course, there are certain views that we maintain for a very long time, but there are other views that are almost just a little bit kind of coming and going, right? And we should be totally fine with this change of ideas at different times of our lives. And there is,
it would be boring not to change at all, right? Not to change your opinions.
but I don't want to sort of diverge completely from.
No, let's go back.
Yeah, let's go back for a little bit. I was very excited actually when this theme came up of art and social sciences, and you were mentioning a lot music and sound. Both can be considered art forms, even though sound is something that is like omnipresent around us. But I guess there's been a lot of different people nowadays playing around with sound as compositions and as making it into installations. So how do you see this intersecting with something as the social sciences, as in like social research, etc.?
I think sociology as a tool set is just so necessary for art and music to kind of to take it away from this, I don't know, iron throne of being somewhat divine, related to reality kind of thing. I think we have, especially in music. So, musician and the muse of arts, and is somewhat not is above the everyday mundanity, and we don't talk about where our cables come from, and how does that relate to work, like labor chains and etc. I'm just naming some examples, but I think we need to look at any kind of art or music and sound as a, first of all, very human. I think anthropology, I suppose, is a field that I'm most curious about in that sense, but sociology is very close to that. So as a social activity, we can't separate art and artist and artwork from the everyday realities. And when we talk about perceiving art and when experiencing art, these are also inevitably social experiences. I once again want to kind of mention that the physical element of art spaces, how sound, let's say, we're talking, if we're talking about sound and art, how sound found its place within an art gallery, and how going to an art gallery is in itself also like a social phenomena, which not only from this kind of white cube perspective that there is a certain elitism assigned to an art gallery, which implies that there are certain social groups or groups of people who are allowed within the gallery and allowed out of it, being it women, being it black people, being it queer people. I suppose queer people maybe again, well, it's just we kind of know this is the history of contemporary art 101. But I think there is also in that if it is such a social activity, I sometimes think that it's also because we really just want to have a good time in that gallery. And I think this is something that I kind of miss talking about in terms of art and social sciences, is that art gallery is also a tool for community building, for citizenly participation, for, after the pandemic. Art gallery is a place where we go and we finally see somebody else. So, even aside all the academic stuff, it's a social activity because we're there with other people, and that the whole thing.
Yes, I wanted to really specifically look at sound and music in this respect, as sound found its space as an art form. I guess that mainly it has been located in the context of galleries. Maybe you have some other idea that I cannot think about, but when I imagine a sound installation or a sound composition, I often, not always, but just see it in this space of a gallery, maybe differently than music at this point. Very interesting to me. Last summer, I was in this residency in Czech Republic, and we had this sound workshop experimenting with transmitters.
Okay.
And sort of like seeing sounds that come out of objects,
Yeah.
sounds that come out of the earth, and what you can do with that. And I'm just so curious to know, how do you see this parallel between what I've just been talking about and how we can make this a social experience, as you were saying before?
Yeah. Well, I think there is something in the history of sound art as well that kind of, for me, informs what sound art is today and can be in the future, which is, fluxes and surrealism, a bit futurists. So Luigi Russolo was the guy who kind of started scaring the audiences with his sound experiments. So in the interwar. And I think, and for me, one of the reasons why I really love sound art, and I think sometimes now in the galleries it's being left behind, is this legacy of rebellion. So, sound art was a rebellious way to disturb art gallery goers from their comfortable positions and make a bit of a joke out of it, not necessarily joke, haha, but joke as in, maybe shock a little bit, or be a bit extravagant, and kind of all of that, very, as I said, futurism, Dadaism, fluxus, all of these movements. And I want to keep that in sound art, this not taking yourself too seriously element, because I think there is, I don't know, we were talking about this with a friend, whether the fact that sound people, or whatever, sound art is, let's say, less concerned with the visible, though it is still, installations and sculptures, they still usually take visible forms. Does that mean that appearance also means less? And in that sense, does that mean that there is the image and the vanity that comes with it also mean less? This is something that I don't know the answers, and I'm not trying to say that sound art is somehow more immune to vanity than visual art is. And I'm trying to say that visual art is vain. But I think that, can we somehow not lose that playfulness of sound, and that I think visual art has lost, or, well, it's regaining now, but historically has lost a bit, because it has been seen as such a such an important part of human activity. One thing we should do in life is to cause a bit of chaos, I think chaos is healthy for all of us, just to doubt, I don't know, ourselves a little bit. So, this unseriousness. So I think, there isn't really a canon for sound art, even though there has been so much done, and there are people who have been canonized in that sense. They have become these legends. I think, this is my personal opinion. Also in Lithuania, it's quite interesting, because I think sound art is, I think in New York or London, sound art is probably, or Paris, sound art is already also in a way, established. Here in Lithuania, it isn't yet as much, I think. And I think it then becomes quite exciting, that nobody really knows what to expect. So as an artist, you can be very liberated from pretense.
Yes, and I feel actually, even on without having to be an artist, or without having to do anything specifically with playing around with sound, I feel like after I had this experience during these sound workshops, we were literally just closing our eyes and paying attention to sounds, and writing afterwards what we were kind of perceiving, and discussing it as a group of people, like things that you don't even really think about in your day to day, how much sound is connected to memories, and how it can move you from the place where you are immediately into another place that you kind of forgot about in your head, and it kind of like brings you back there.
And I think there's also what you mentioned in a different context before, but this element of care that comes with listening. You talked about soundwalks, and I remember Paulina Oliveros, who's her radical listening, and work on soundscapes, and field recordings was still is very sort of revolutionary and radical. This is something that I hope we will be able to maintain, that in order to do sound art, we need to listen to our environments and ourselves and each other, which I think is a good practice, whatever you do, really. I think it allows you a different relationship to your environment and the world, a more careful one and a more caring one, and
yeah, of course, listening, paying attention, and sort of just really being immersed into what is right in front of you. But then also it has this more universal, more encompassing feeling to it. Like you can be listening to a soundscape and kind of relate to how a place might be. Maybe it's not exactly like that, but you find this element of like relation, to this other space where you're not present.
definitely, it's also about you, that you will, what you hear is also about you. You as a listener bring agency to your soundscape, whatever it would be. So it's never that listening is a both way relationship, the same way as talking to one another is, or it's a part of it as well. So I think this is quite nice.
You were talking about these different places in which you have worked on projects like radio shows, like different cities. And as we're talking about specific soundscapes, it made me think about the specificity of certain communities in those different cities. And if you have found in this context between, let's say, the locality of the Netherlands and the locality of Lithuania, if you see that radio can acquire like a different role according to different spaces in which they're hosted.
Definitely. I think I think there are different problems. I wouldn't say that it's well, so I think it's easier to do things in the Netherlands because there's a system and infrastructure for culture which is much richer, older, and has its audience already, so it's easier in some ways. I think in the Netherlands and in Amsterdam, I suppose I should talk about Amsterdam because I know best about Amsterdam. There is a thirst for new ideas, I think, and there's a thirst to for new kind of curatorial work. I think people are almost outsourcing, or well, it's a very complicated issue, I think, because from the one hand I was lacking revisit, like, sort of post-colonial discourse sometimes in Amsterdam. Uh, but at the same time, there was that, and when it was done, it was very easily accepted. It wasn't really. I don't think it was like people that were against it. It. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think the difficulty in Amsterdam is to address issues that have not been addressed in a honest manner. I don't know if I'm being clear in this. Maybe I should paraphrase.
Yeah, I think the question is specifically related to, this action of conversation and speaking, which is like included in radio and in the same as public events in sound in action. If any locality, in this case, we're getting the example of Amsterdam and Vilnus, but if you have perceived in your own personal experience that a locality of a place really makes these tools of a different use for what they are, they hold different places in different localities.
Mm. It's like building a connection, right? I think it's just like, when I think about it in the European context, I think that there is a certain new demographic. Well, it's not really new, but there is a demographic of being translocal European that I think is stronger than any kind of locality, to be honest. Because when I think about Amsterdam, I think about all of our events. And one was about Dutch hip hop and identity that we did. The event was done online. There was also about this gentrification in Amsterdam in the school. So, I mean, even though the topics, we really wanted it to be Dutch topics and local topics, our team was Portuguese person, a Lithuanian person, a British person, then a Dutch person joined. So, like, it was very, very international in a sense that, or yeah, it would be a Brazilian performer on our first event. And, so it's, and I think in Lithuania, sometimes also I feel the most understood when my shows are done with people who have either had experience of living abroad or it is a international conversation, not always. I had this wonderful show with two Polish activists from Warsaw that we did a chat. I had a very nice chat with this Matteo Spano from Kashmir Radio. He's Italian. He lives in Berlin. I came to Berlin. We did a chat, like we recorded our conversation. So I think, and I think when you're with audiences like that, whether it's your person you're talking to or people who are listening to you, I feel this is where we feel most at home, in a sense. And but also, of course, there is a necessity to always address these local issues. So I think it's a real struggle again. Here we would talk about something like, I don't know, higher education, musical education in Lithuania, and people who would come to my show would be like still quite upset that this or that isn't the way it could be done, or the criticism is very embodied. Whereas in the Netherlands, I think it's much more abstract, and this can be a good thing because I think this abstract distance allows you to be more constructive, clear. Perhaps it can be more powerful in this way, in this more, let's say, analytical way. However, it can be more emotionally powerful or exciting in Lithuania, let's say. So I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like we covered quite a bit of ground. I'm so curious to know eventually more about your research as it will progress.
Me too.
And and I actually do have one last question, which I think would be interesting maybe for people who are not so familiar with how a research is really done for a PhD. Who are you going to interview? Like, do you have already some specific people? Have you been sort of putting down your list of interviews? I'm just curious, like, what your plan is.
Well, still, I don't know if I got the PhD, so I'm not yet a PhD student, right? So this is the first hoop I need to jump. So my research was in community radios in the Eastern European region, and I wanted to look into Kiev, Tbilisi, Minsk, perhaps. So, since the war started, it's very difficult to tell what I will be able to do and, how things are what's gonna happen. So my research will definitely be working around the reality, the horrible reality that Ukraine is facing, and there are some exile. But anyway, like before that, so because my interview happened literally on the first day of the war. But before that, there are community radios in Kiev. They're still doing things now, collecting money. It's 20 Feet Radio. Check them out if you're listening to this. There was a Minsk community radio, but I think they relocated it to Vilnus, which is quite convenient for me. But there are also there's Mutant Radio Tbilisi, Capital in Warsaw, Lamajun in Budapest, Kashmir in Berlin, Ida in Estonia. There are all of these community radios working in the region. So that's where I would start, kind of talking to people.
Yeah. And I guess you mentioned, the unfortunate reality of what is happening right now. I don't know if you know of any sort of community that you just mentioned, one that is still working.
There is also a very nice initiative from these community radios I mentioned. We all collaborated to have like a shared broadcast across the radio stations with mixes from different ones in support of Ukraine. So all of this, like Mutant, Kashmir, Ida, Capital. Well, 20 Feet was, I suppose. There were more Vilnus radios as well. Startfm, the one I'm part of, and Palanga Street Radio. So people just kind of created like a shared broadcast where they all just played mixes with Ukrainian music. So there's so much. I will make sure to send you things. But this community radio scene, it's working also as a community of communities, which is very beautiful. Yeah.
Well, I would like you to take a ruin out of our conversation, to take like a piece of it. Think of something. You have no idea who's coming after you. You have no idea who they are. Yeah, what is a theme that you would like them to sort of go through?
There's quite a few that I was running into in my head while you were asking that question, but I think I will go with care. Yeah, I think I've only mentioned it a few times, so it's not like it wasn't really a big topic in our conversation. But I think it would suit for late modernity to talk about care.
Great.
Right?
If you get the chance to listen to our first episode, Marta and I were really just talking about this. Well, we kind of said that this podcast is a methodology of care in a way. So I think
it is. It's, some of my guests actually, they describe, there was 2 times that someone left my show and said, it felt like a therapy session. And that for me, that's the biggest compliment ever. But there were like a few people actually that said that they feel like they have just went to therapy after leaving my show. So maybe that's a nice way of closing and bridging it with the next show.
looking forward to see what Marta and her guests are going to be sort of talking about through this topic, which is a very important one. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a lovely day.
Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If you want to dive deeper into the show, don't forget to check the podcast description for extra resources, contact information, and a sign-up form for our newsletter. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, take care.